Next up, while most producers are done with their pesticide treatments this season, it's still important to keep checking those fields to reduce the risk of future infestations. Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with Extension Entomologist Julie Peterson to see what pests producers should be on the lookout for through the end of the growing season.
Many row crop producers have successfully applied pesticide applications to their fields, and doing so have come a step closer to improving those yield totals for the 2021 growing season. However, just because spraying's been completed doesn't mean the work is entirely over. In fact, in July, many producers saw a very high rate of western bean cutworm moth infestation.
So we have had a really big flight of the western bean cutworm moths in Nebraska this year. Especially in areas kind of in the west central part of the state. We actually had a record of over 1,200 moths in one night collected in the North Platte blacklight trap. That's the most that we've had in the last 8 summers. Kind of accordingly with those large flights, we also saw pretty high infestation rates. Our economic threshold is 5 to 8% of plants infested. And we saw fields above that economic threshold pretty regularly. In the west central and a little bit into the south central parts of the state of Nebraska.
Western bean cutworms and corn rootworm beetles are an annual problem in some areas of the state. Even though pesticide applications have been made, it is paramount to continue scouting fields to make sure the treatments were effective and to ensure you're not experiencing any flare-ups of spider mites.
So most of those treatments would have already gone out in the state of Nebraska. It is important to follow up, however, if you have sprayed insecticides in your fields, especially if you're in an area that has like sandy, well-draining soils where your crops may be exposed to some drought stress, because those fields are going to be more susceptible to having spider mite outbreaks. We do see that with applications of insecticides. Whether those insecticides are targeting western bean cutworm or maybe corn rootworm beetles, that those insecticides can remove the beneficial insects out there, the things like predatory mites or lady beetles that are helping to keep the spider mites in check. And without those good guys there kind of keeping them in control, those spider mites can really flare up. So I do recommend checking your fields, especially those that have been sprayed for spider mite flare-ups. And it's always good to also check and see how effective your applications were, whether you were targeting corn rootworm or targeting western bean cutworm. Follow up and see, did the products work? What was your treatment approach there effective?
If you do happen to notice a flare-up of spider mites, you may not necessarily need to treat. That is unless you notice an infestation encroaching the economic threshold.
For spider mites in corn, the economic threshold is when you find that yellow or white stippling, that's sort of that discoloration, kind of spotty discoloration that you can see on the leaves that's caused from the mites. If the lower third of the plant has that stippling, and then mite colonies are found in the middle third of the plant, the height of the mite colonies is sort of pushing vertically up to the height of the ear leaf. That's what we consider to be an economic threshold for spider mites in corn. If you're looking at spider mites in soybeans, the economic threshold there is when the lower third of the plant has that heavy stippling, that's that heavy kind of yellow and white discoloration. You might see some leaf loss in that lower third of the canopy. The middle third of the plant will have some stippling and mites present. And then you'll find scattered mite colonies on the upper third of the plant, up in the top third of the canopy. And that's what we consider the economic threshold, the time when you would need to treat for spider mites in soybeans.
Likewise, when it comes to corn rootworm beetles, odds are, if you've had a problem, it's been treated already. However, with this particular pest, you're going to want to keep an eye on any remaining adult beetles in order to try to reduce the number of eggs they could lay, which could be problematic during the next growing season.
However, if you're a bit later down in pollination, what you're doing in terms of beetle management would actually be to target the beetles to reduce their numbers so that they're reducing egg laying in terms of how much larval pressure will be in that field next year if you plan to keep that field in corn in the following year. So an economic threshold that you can use for corn rootworm beetles, if you're talking about reducing egg laying, reducing pressure for next year, is if there's 0.75 beetles per plant during scouting, or if you're catching 6 beetles per trap per day, if you're using yellow sticky cards that have been placed out in the fields. As far as things that you can do this year, most of that would be like aerial or chemigation application of insecticides. And that again is going to be important to think about which products you're using. In the western part of the state, we have seen considerable problems with some of the pyrethroid insecticides, with western corn rootworm having developed resistance to those. So again, you want to be careful about your product choice and look for an active ingredient that is going to be effective against the beetles. And then also keep in mind not trying to flare spider mites as well with your applications.
As we reach the finish line of yet another growing season, it's imperative that producers keep a close eye on these pests in order to game plan for next year. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.